Buenas tardes. Quiero daros a todos la bienvenida en nombre del European Council on Foreign Relations, cuya oficina en Madrid tengo el honor de dirigir. Quiero, por supuesto, agradecer a las instituciones europeas el habernos facilitado este espacio para hacer la presentación de este informe, el European Foreign Policy Scorecard, la edición de 2012, que es un intento sistemático de capturar y evaluar la política exterior europea. Ha venido Hans Kundnani, el director editorial de ECFR, para presentar este informe. Hoy este tipo de actos se ha celebrado a lo largo de estos últimos meses y medio a lo largo de toda Europa. Como saben, somos una institución paneuropea que quiere hablar en nombre de Europa. Hoy en Bruselas se ha tenido lugar la presentación de este mismo informe esta mañana. Hans Kundnani ha hecho una presentación también de este informe en varias capitales europeas a lo largo de los últimos meses, con personalidades también muy destacadas de la vida política europea. Así que está un poco en este momento al final de un roadshow que le ha llevado desde Roma a Berlín, a Varsovia, a Riga y a lugares varios, intentando recolectar estos puntos de vista también sobre en qué estado estamos en estos momentos en cuanto a la política exterior europea. Están también con nosotros Lluís Bassets, que es miembro del comité científico que nos ha ayudado a poner en marcha esta empresa, este proyecto tan ambicioso del ECFR, European Foreign Policy Scorecard. Nos acompaña también Jordi Vaquer, porque hemos tenido una colaboración muy estrecha del CIDOB en Barcelona a la hora de llevar a cabo este informe con sus investigadores. Nos han ayudado a realizar la contribución del estudio de caso de España. Tenemos, por supuesto, y como no, y quería agradecer muy especialmente a Javier Solana el que haya accedido hoy a acompañarnos, a hacer un hueco en su agenda para estar con nosotros, a colaborar en esta presentación. No, obviamente Javier Solana en nuestra presentación está hoy aquí también en su condición de miembro de la Comisión Ejecutiva del European Council on Foreign Relations y estamos muy agradecidos de que alguien que ha creado prácticamente desde casi sus comienzos una gran parte de lo que es la política exterior europea esté hoy aquí con nosotros y nos vaya a ayudar a desentrañar el futuro, el presente y el futuro del momento en el que estamos en la construcción europea y en la construcción de esa política exterior común. Es un informe complejo en el que han participado muchas personas, 27 casos de estudio nacionales, con un comité científico muy amplio, 40 expertos, 6 áreas, 80 componentes, tendrán los detalles. Es un ejercicio muy ambicioso. Simplemente yo termino aquí dando las gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañan hoy, a las que están hoy aquí en la mesa y, como decía, muy especialmente a Javier, que es un orgullo y motivo de satisfacción que nos hayas podido acompañar hoy aquí. Gracias a él. Gracias.
Sí, muchas gracias, Nacho. Mi nombre es Francisco Fonseca, soy el director de la representación de la Comisión Europea en España y simplemente en mi nombre y en el de mi colega del Parlamento Europeo, Nelson Samper, que está fuera de Madrid, quería decir que para nosotros es un honor acoger esta presentación hoy aquí y que en realidad si alguien tiene que estar agradecido somos las instituciones europeas, pensando que el European Council on Foreign Relations ha decidido hacer esta presentación aquí, en lo que nosotros llamamos la Casa Europa. No voy a aburrirles ya nada más, simplemente darle la bienvenida y creo que hemos venido a escuchar a los autores. Por consiguiente, Mr. Kundnani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much to the European Commission Office for having us, and thank you all for coming. As Nacho mentioned, I've been going around Europe talking about the scorecard, and it's very interesting to hear different views in different countries, so I'm really looking forward to hearing some views from Spain. What I'm going to try to do briefly is introduce the scorecard to you, to tell you a bit about what it is, what it aims to do, how we did it, and then to give you a sense of the findings. It's quite a big document, so it's quite difficult to summarise it, so I'm going to talk quite quickly and try to whiz through it, and I'm happy to come back to any of the particular points I raise later on in the discussion. So first of all, what is the scorecard? The idea behind the scorecard was that in each member state in the European Union, or most member states, you have a debate about national foreign policy. And then you also have a debate about European foreign policy, but it often tends to be a quite institutional debate. What we wanted to do after the Lisbon Treaty came into effect at the end of 2009 was to try to bring those two debates together and to have a broader debate about European foreign policy that was very much focused on Europe's objectives in the world and to try to assess in a comprehensive, systematic and transparent way how effective Europe is in achieving those goals. What it isn't is a quasi-scientific study. We make a political judgment in each of the scores and grades that we give to Europe on each of the different areas. And each time we categorize the member states, I'll come back to that later on, we make a political judgment, and the idea was to stimulate a debate about European foreign policy, and we want people to challenge the grades and the categorization of member states. We don't see them as being definitive. The project was very much a collective project. I was the project leader together with Justin Vase, who is based in Washington, but there was a big team of around 40 researchers, around 15 experts at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and as Nacho mentioned, another 27 researchers, one in each of the member states, to try to help us understand in a bit more detail the decisions and positions that individual member states took during the course of 2011. We were also advised by a steering group or a scientific committee, as Nacho mentioned, which Lluís was part of, that guided us during the process of the research. We divided, we assessed European foreign policy on 6 broad issues, and I'll come back to those a bit later on. And each of the 6 issues in turn are divided into what we call components, which are very specific aspects of European foreign policy that change from year to year. And it's on these components, around 80 in total, that we give scores that are then translated into grades. We award these scores on the basis of 3 categories: unity, resources, and outcome. In other words, how united were Europeans? And that means both member states and unity between the member states on the one hand and the EU institutions on the other. Secondly, resources, how hard did Europeans try? How many resources did they devote to this particular issue, whether it's political resources, financial resources, military resources? And finally, outcome. In other words, how successful were Europeans in achieving their objectives on this particular issue? We give scores from grades from A to D, what we mean by Europe when we talk about European performance is not just the EU institutions. This isn't just an assessment of how well the EU institutions are doing. It's the sum total of European actions, which means the member states plus the EU institutions. We try to look, in a sense, at Europe in the same way that people around the world look at Europe. Say in Brazil or in China or in the US, they don't necessarily care too much about whether it's the EU institutions that are acting or whether it's the member states. They just see Europe as a whole acting. I guess the Libya war is a good example of that. It was perceived as being a European war, even though it was actually only a group of member states, not even all member states, that were involved in it. And finally, in this second edition of the scorecard, a new element that we've introduced for the first time is a systematic categorization of member states. And so we categorize them as leaders, supporters, or slackers on 30 of the 80 components. It doesn't make sense to do it on all 80 components because in some cases it's the EU institutions rather than the member states that take decisions. But on some of the components, we try to categorize the role that different member states play, and I'll come back to that a bit later on as well. Before I tell you a little bit about the findings for 2011, perhaps just a word about the context, because 2011 was the second year after the Lisbon Treaty had come into effect, but it was also obviously the second year of the Euro crisis. And this is very much the background to everything that Europe did in foreign policy in 2011. And we think that something happened, something quite important happened in 2011. In 2010, the first year of the crisis, it was a problem for Europe. In 2011, the second year of the crisis, it started to become a problem for the whole of the rest of the world. So you now have, for example, economists in China and in the US thinking not just about whether the euro is going to survive, but how to limit the turmoil that a collapse of the euro might cause for them.